Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia and welcome back to our 10-part guide series covering reforms in Total War 3 Kingdoms. This episode is part 4 and will be an overview of the yellow reforms. So let's get started. As we can see here, there are a total of 18 yellow reforms. They correspond to the commander class and provide unlocks to commander retinue units. They also unlock government buildings, increase public order, reduce corruption, add additional administrator and assignment slots, reduce salaries for characters, and due to their proximity to the purple or economic reform branches, they also provide a bit of income multiplier boost to your empire. Today, we are going to go over all 18 of these reforms individually, but before we can do that, I want to continue what we have done in part 2 and 3 with the green and red reforms and redraw the yellow portion of the reform tree, so we can do away with all the beautiful artistic branches and show clear lines of progression. This is to alleviate the overcrowding on the screen, and more importantly here, because there is a mistake on the yellow reform tree. If we look at this branch here, the artistic branch implies that these three reforms follow each other in terms of progression, when in reality, this fourth reform here is actually a prerequisite for the two reforms on the end of the branch. Therefore, it means that these two artistic branch here are drawn incorrectly and should be replaced with a single branch shown here. To showcase this more clearly and to improve our discussion, I have redrawn the reform trees for the yellow portion in the same style that we have done so for the green and red reforms from our earlier parts. I have the 6th Bureau of Bureaucracy highlighted in red because it requires the retainer army reform from the red reforms to unlock. We have seen similar requirements in the red reform and will continue to see this for the remaining colors as well. This is due to the wuxing synergy interactions in the game, which weaves the branches of different colors together according to the property of wuxing. Other than that, we can apply tiers again here to facilitate our discussion. The yellow reform is almost the exact opposite of the red reforms. Whereas the red reform started with one tier 1 branch and branched out to multiple branches, the yellow reform, as shown here, starts out with 4 different tier 1 reforms and eventually weaves back together into one tier 5 reform in the Mandate of Heaven. This will actually make our discussion a little easier, as there are less interactions between the branches in the yellow reform when compared to our previous discussions with the green and red reform. So let's get started with the 4 tier 1 reform. We start with the Register of Land and Population reform. As the game info panel reads, this branch focuses on more efficient taxation and higher income. As this reform is the only tier 1 reform to not require a certain building to unlock, it is the true starter reform and can be your faction's free starting reform if your faction's playstyle is deemed to be more government based. In terms of passive bonuses, this reform boosts peasantry income by 15%. It's not a huge bonus, but a welcome one nonetheless. Next, we have the Mastery of Ceremonies reform. This reform requires the level 2 temple building to be built before it can be unlocked. Its in-game info panel states that this branch leads to improvements in public order, which coincidentally enough is exactly its passive bonus, which adds 3 public order to all your commanderies. The design of this reform is excellent. Since you would only build the temple building when you have public order issues, it makes complete sense that your actions would then lead to unlocking a branch of the reforms that further helps you in that effort. Next, we have the eunuch secretaries. If you've seen the opening intro of the game, then you probably heard about how the eunuchs corrupted the court and led to the chaos of the Three Kingdom period. It is definitely not an everyday word in English, so I would like to provide a tad bit of trivia, as this channel is called Serious Trivia, and explain what and who eunuchs are. Eunuchs are men who serve the emperor inside the royal palace. For the purpose of keeping the royal bloodline pure, the kingdom can't risk any potential affairs between the empress or the emperor's other concubines with any men other than the emperor. So these palace servants were castrated. Now, in the time of the Han Dynasty, which is an early period in Chinese history, this requirement of castration was still loosely enforced, and there were still uncastrated men who were eunuchs. Castration does sound like a steep requirement for a job, but eunuchs in this later periods of the Han Dynasty held immense power because they had the ears of the emperor. The penultimate emperor of the Han, or Liu Hong, who is the father of the child emperor in the game, trusted his eunuchs so much that he referred to one of them as his godfather, and entrusted much of the administrative roles of the empire to his 10 most trusted eunuchs. It was this type of power and corruption that eventually broke down the Han and led to the Three Kingdoms period. Another interesting fact is that Cao Cao's father, Cao Song, was the adopted son of Cao Teng, who was a lifelong eunuch who served under 4 emperors. It was through this relationship that Cao Song was able to enter the government and enrich himself through corruption, and later jumpstart Cao Cao's rise to power. Okay, that's enough of a tangent for today, and let's continue with our guide. So the eunuch secretary reform requires you to have a level 4 settlement or a small city commandery before you can unlock it. The in-game info panel also states that this branch focuses on better overall administration. Its passive bonus adds 1 additional administrator, since administrators are powerful tools to help you commandery's economy and defense, as well as boost the selected character's satisfaction. This is a great reform to pick up in the early game. And once again, this reform gets an A+ for design, as it requires you to have a small city first, which is also the perfect time for you to pick up administrator. Lastly, we have the Bureau of Banditry. This reform requires the level 1 tax collection building to unlock. It enables a branch that leads to lower corruption and improved public order. And it offers a passive bonus of +2 public order to all commanderies faction-wide. As someone who loves the tax collection building chain, I often go for this reform in my games. And I have always found the name of this reform to be a bit of poetic justice, because in essence, you are using a reform to form a bureau to fight off bandits, simply because you raised the taxes to a point where you forced otherwise law-abiding citizens into banditry. Now, that covers our 4 branch starting Tier 1 reforms, so let's move on to the Tier 2 reforms. In Tier 2, there are once again 4 reforms, and we can start with the Civil Service Recommendation Reform, which simply provides a passive bonus of 10% income from all sources. This is a pretty solid bonus, but there isn't much else to say about it. Next, we have the Principle of Wei. It might look like the name of 2 of the 3 kingdoms put together, but they're actually phonetically 2 different words in Chinese, and it means selflessness. Therefore, it makes sense that this reform will reduce character salaries by 20%, as their selflessness enables them to take a pay cut to continue to work for you. On top of that, it adds 8 points of satisfaction to commanders. Next, we have the regular palace attendant reform, which doesn't have any passive bonuses, but it does unlock a unit and 2 buildings. If you missed out on any of our earlier parts, we are saving all the discussions for building and unit unlocks in parts 7 and 8, so we'll refrain from discussing them much here. Lastly, we have the 5 punishments reform, which adds a 5% reduction to corruption faction-wide. This is a powerful bonus and should be taken in the mid to late game to help fight corruption in your growing empire. With that, we're done with Tier 2 and can move on to Tier 3 reforms, where we can start with the Iron and Salt agencies. Once again, like its predecessors in the Register of Land and Population and the Civil Recommendation reforms, this is another income multiplier reform. This time, your industry income will receive a 15% boost, and that is all this reform does. Next, we have the Eunuch Inspectors reform, which simply adds 1 additional assignment slot. As you can see already, each individual branch of the yellow branch strongly adhere to its theme and offers simple thematic bonuses like here and nothing else. Next, we have the Metropolitan Superintendent's reform, which decreases settlement upgrade costs by 10%. And lastly, we have the Commissioners of Passage, which provides 3 additional public water in all your commanderies faction-wide. Next, we move on to Tier 4, where our simple yellow reform tree finally develops some branching, as we now have 5 reforms instead of the 4 from the last 3 tiers. Here we have the merchant tax exemption, which continues the trend of income multiplier reforms that it follows to continue to provide income multiplier for industry, silk, and spices. Silk and spices are rare resources that you can only find in specialized counties on the northwestern and southwestern regions of the map. They are considered to be separate income sources and can be quite lucrative addition to your economy. Next, we have the coin minting reform, which provides 8% corruption reduction faction-wide. As with the 5 punishment reform, this is another key mid to late game reform to help fight corruption as you grow the size of your empire. Following that, we have selling of titles. This reform looks terrible on paper. It decreases satisfaction of all your characters by 5 and adds a 5% corruption to your empire, all for just 25% discount on your character's salary. Which it is a big discount, but if you don't have high enough satisfaction or corruption reduction mechanism in place, the saving will not be worth its cost. In our more advanced parts of this series, we will discuss a potential use of this reform where it can be helpful, but for now, we can generalize and say that this is a pretty trash tier reform and should be avoided in most games. After all, selling of title of government job is one of the corrupt policies of the eunuchs that eventually undid the Han. Next, we have the 6 bureaus of bureaucracy, which provides an additional administrator and adds 12 points satisfaction for commanders. Lastly, we have officer relocation, which decreases corruption by 6% faction-wide. And before we move on to the Tier 5 reforms, I want to go on a little aside here. So a subscriber has recently asked me for a detailed list of commanderies that is best fit to be used for adjacent commandery bonuses to fight corruption. And after we have gone over so many corruption fighting reforms here in the yellow reform, I just want to say that I'm in the process of making a better commandery guide covering how to run a corruption-free empire, which I plan to drop soon. So please stay tuned for that. Okay. Now let's wrap up our overview of all 18 yellow reform with the ultimate tier 5 reform in the Mandate of Heaven. In terms of passive bonuses, it only adds 10 point satisfaction to all your characters. More importantly, it unlocks the yellow dragon unit and a level 5 administrator office building in the palace. With that, we have completed our overview of all the reforms, but to better understand the strategies revolving around the yellow reform, we have to take a step back and look at a rendering of the yellow portion of the reform tree and analyze the bigger picture by looking at it branch by branch. Because after all, that's how you acquire these reforms in game. To start, we have the income multiplier branch. This branch is the closest branch to the purple or economic reforms, and it even serves as a prerequisite branch for a few purple reforms. So it's not surprising that this branch provides a multitude of income multiplier from various income sources. Now this branch is usually a great mid-game branch as your base economy has developed. But in the early game, before you have that base of flat income, this branch is not really going to yield you much. So it's better to take this later on once your empire has grown a bit. Next, we have the Mandate of Heaven branch. This is the ultimate branch in the yellow reform portion of the reform tree, and it's made of essentially 3 separate smaller branches. And to make the discussion easier, we will look at these small branches separately and then finally combine them together as we discuss just the Mandate of Heaven. So first we have branch number 1, which ends in the coin minting reform. I call this branch the anti-corruption copper branch. This branch is the same as the first income multiplier branch, except for the last reform, where we branch out towards coin minting rather than merchant tax exemption. In this branch, you lose out on some of the more unique income multipliers from silk and spice, and instead gain an 8% reduction in corruption. The coin minting reform also unlocks the level 5 copper mine upgrade that provides 4% additional faction-wide corruption reduction. Since how crazy uncontrolled corruption can be, I highly recommend planning to take this route as soon as you secure your first copper mine. Next, we have a very short branch made up of Mastery of Ceremony and Principle of Wu Wei. These two reforms unlock bonuses to public order, reduce character salary, and add 8 points of satisfaction for commanders. None of these are particularly useful, so I named this branch the This Can Wait branch. The truth is, there are much better branches out there just within the yellow reform tree. So for this branch, I think the only thing you can consider is maybe taking the Master of Ceremonies, as it does increase public order by 3, which can be very helpful for your higher population settlements, as well as enable you to gain more income from tax collection building trains. Finally, we have the third piece of the puzzle in the More Administrator branch. Following this branch would add 2 administrators to the game. It would also provide a 10% discount to settlement upgrade and 12 points in your commander satisfaction. The 2 administrators that you can pick up are super relevant and useful throughout the game. The 10% discount is nothing to sleep on, since settlement upgrades gets progressively more expensive, and without Wuxing building synergy discounts, settlement upgrade can be a huge drain on your economy. So we'll be happily taking these discounts wherever we can get them. You must also note that the 6 bureaus of bureaucracy reform at the end of the branch also requires the retainer army reform from the red reform to unlock. Therefore, while the rewards for this branch is excellent, the cost in terms of number of turns required is equally huge. Finally, we can combine these 3 branches and their bonuses to unlock the Mandate of Heaven. This is definitely a super late game reform, as even if you start the game by rushing it, it would take you 70 turns to reach it, and you'd be done with the early game without much to show for it. And your reward at the end of rushing it will just simply be 10 points in satisfaction for all characters, a yellow dragon unit, and the palace building that you can only build once. So I don't recommend this brand as much, but I do endorse portions of this branch, such as the coin minting branch for anti-corruption and income multiplier boost that it brings, and parts of the more administrative branch to get those valuable administrators early on. But don't go all in for the Mandate of Heaven. It's not going to be worth your time. Next, we have Selling of the Titles branch, which I like to call the Cheap and Corrupt branch. This branch shares half of its reform with the just mentioned More Administrator branch, but instead of a second administrator, this branch adds on 1 additional assignment, and the controversial Selling of Title reform, which actually increases your corruption and decreases satisfaction in order to gain a 25% discount to character salaries. Despite these debuffs, I actually can see some use for this branch, and would not completely deem it trash tier branch, but this would be a very specialized or niche strategy you can attempt in the late game, which we'll talk about in part 10 of this series. Lastly, we have this isolated branch of the yellow reform tree that sits alone in the anti-corruption tax branch. Previously, we have had the anti-corruption copper branch focused on copper mine specialty county. This time, this branch focused on the tax collection building chain and provides a complementary bonus in an 11% corruption reduction and a +5 to public order. The 11% corruption reduction will help you actually receive most of your taxes, and the +5 public order enables a few more levels of your tax collection building chain to be built, which decreases public order. As a fan of this particular building chain, I love this branch and strongly endorse you to try it. With that, this concludes part 4 of the series covering the yellow reforms. I hope you can take something learned here to add to your game, and look forward to having y'all back in part 5 as we move on to the real moneymakers in the game in the purple reform. Once again, if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel to receive notifications of the latest episodes, guides, and Let's Play videos. I also take requests in the comment section for other guides that you want to see on the channel, as well as general suggestions to help improve this channel. So please feel free to drop a comment below. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and see y'all next time. Bye!